This is the Sports and Society podcast, where we go beyond scores, statistics, and personalities to focus on issues and controversies in sports worlds. Your hosts, Jake Oakley and Jeff Montes de Oca, are sports sociologists and the authors of the book, Sports and Society, Issues and Controversies. The episodes in this podcast give you a behind-the-scenes look at the textbook with stories from our lives as scholars and athletes, as well as providing analysis of ongoing issues and controversies in contemporary sport worlds. We welcome hearing your thoughts and analysis, so please use this space to engage with us about the textbook or any of the topics we cover in this podcast. Hello and welcome to Sports and Society Podcast. Your hosts are Jake Oakley and Jeff Montes de Oca. This is a special episode and one we feel is particularly important since it will touch aspects of every chapter in the textbook, really. What we want to do in this episode is focus on the relationship between sports sociology and sport management, since the two are oftentimes presented as conflicting and even antagonistic. So we have two amazing sport management scholars who are also very sociological in their backgrounds and their current scholarship. And by way of full disclosure, we actually did a panel at a conference on this topic a few months ago. And so we're a little bit rehearsed on this discussion, but it'll still be dynamic. Well, let me introduce our guests for today. I'm thrilled to welcome John Singer and Ajane Keaton. John N. Singer is going into his 20th year as a faculty member in the sport management program at Texas A&M University. His research has particularly focused on race and racism at the intersections of sport, education, and society. He is author of the book, Race, Sports, and Education, Improving Opportunities and Outcomes for Black Male College Athletes, and that was with Harvard Education Press. Ajane Keaton is an assistant professor of sport management at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Dr. Keaton's research explores how systemic inequities shape organized behavior, media portrayals in sports, and the broader influence of social politics on the industry. Dr. Keaton is also deeply committed to creating tangible systemic changes within sport organizations. So she doesn't just talk about it, she actually does the work. Well, John and Ajane, welcome to the podcast. All right, let's jump right in. We have two questions. We ask everyone the same two questions. We'll start with Dr. Singer. Please describe your experience in sport.
Okay, thank you, Jeff and Jay, for having me. And so when I think about my experiences in sport, I look at it, my engagement and experience is at the participant, spectator, or fan and employment level, right? And so like a lot of young Black boys growing up in the United States, I had hoop dreams. I played Little League Baseball, and it was my dad who really introduced me to my younger brother and I, who's 18 months my junior. We were socialized together coming up playing Little League Baseball, which actually was my first love, right? Until that middle school, right? We talk a lot about this idea of at the middle school level, unlike basketball and football, baseball is not really an opportunity, at least in my experiences growing up in Michigan. And so for me, it was basketball that really set me down the path of pursuing hoop dreams as again, a lot of the young Black boys do. But through that also, I gained a lot of good friendships that even to this day last. And so I'll stop right there and maybe share more as we go along. I want to be mindful of my airtime.
Dr. Keaton?
Yeah, for me, I started playing sports at the age of 3. My mom says I was chunky, so I was in YMCA soccer, developed a knack for it, played competitive soccer all throughout my youth, played a few ages up. At the same time, around 4 and 5, I picked up softball. And then by the time I hit, second grade, was playing more organized basketball. And so I played all 3 sports. A lot of people don't know this, all the way through high school, and was pretty good at all three, was looking at scholarship opportunities for all three. But in California, soccer and basketball are the same season. And if your team is talented in basketball, then by the time softball starts up, they're halfway through the season. So I never could play varsity softball without missing more than 50% of the season. So basketball was it. I didn't enjoy running, so that's also why basketball became my sport. But I would say I have the really traditional, or what used to be more of a traditional pipeline is you play rec, you play travel ball within your region, you then are maybe good enough for what they now call EYBL, or back then AAU Nationals. You then have your high school team, you get the scholarship. So I also played college basketball at Colorado State University. But that wasn't where I first started. I did a year at San Jose State University. And that is where I think I learned that there's this underbelly to sport. It isn't just playing and being talented, but there are all these cultural and race gendered sexual orientation politics that I was introduced to. Don't hang out with those teammates, or be weary of them, or don't be like them. And coming from the background I did, it was like really shocking to be playing college basketball, not for the sport, but everything that came with it. Another detail a lot of folks don't know is I did 1 year at JUCO. So because of this horrific experience, my first introduction to college basketball, you couldn't just transfer back then. For all the young folks on here, you either lost a year or you had to go down a level, or several levels. So I played junior college basketball and then re-entered the recruiting process and played college basketball. And so then my experience from there, I'll stop, but that's how I became a professor. I took a class titled African American in Sport, and learned about the history of the Black athlete, which is something that was never introduced to me. And I've been involved with studying sport ever since.
Well, Dr. Keaton, that's one more thing we have in common. We both don't like to run. Sadly, I learned very early on cross-country running is the only sport I have natural talent at.
Yeah, I haven't hit that part of adulthood where I pick up marathon and I'm like, yeah, that's probably not going to happen.
Yeah. So, but you've already anticipated our next question, which is, how does your this experience you just described influence and inform the research that you're doing now as a scholar? Why don't you go ahead, Dr. Keaton?
Yeah, I think for me, I didn't know I was like always in this milieu of sociology and management. I think I was always thinking about, all the politics of my identity, because my identity was very different in each of those three places: San Jose State, Foothill Junior College, and Colorado State. And so when I think about my identity, particularly my class identity compared to my teammates, was very different. Coming from a middle to high SES family background compared to my teammates. And then going to Foothill, when you went to a private school, back then going to junior college, it was like a cardinal sin. So then I'm also grappling with how I'm perceived and what does it mean to be a junior college basketball player, particularly in California. And then I go to Colorado State, and I'm one of two Black girls on the team, and half my team is European, which was also very different when thinking about that international athlete. That was something I was never exposed to. And so, like, I think one thing that I learned early on was like the social and political dynamics can be handled different. So, like, that management aspect of it, each coach had their own way of handling it or not. But also the interpretation process of who I was, although I still thought I was AJ, being AJ meant something different in different contexts. And so very early on, I got to see this. And I think being able to name it, I majored in sociology, which I think is also unique now working in a business school. But being in sociology classes and reading about Du Bois and Durkheim and like making connections to sport, it wasn't always so explicit that that was something you can do, but something I'm very grateful I stumbled upon.
Dr. Singer, how about you? How was your sports experience influence and inform the scholarship you do now?
Yeah, so one of my primary areas or lanes that I research in is looking at the experiences of Black males, the Black experience broadly in sport and in through sport, but particularly Black males as a Black male myself. All right. So I got to a certain point in my career where the hoop dreams died, right? And so that was at Michigan State University, where I attempted to walk on to the team, went on academic probation, in fact, and almost lost my academic scholarship in the pursuit of hoop dreams. And so once I realized that GPA was more important than PPG, which I didn't have a PPG because I didn't play, then I gave up the hoop dream, right? And so for me, then I shift into my master's program at Michigan State. So I went and worked for a year in the NFL with the Jacksonville Jaguars after having graduated from Michigan State. Decided I want to go back and get my master's degree in marketing communications, become the next Stuart Scott, the late great Stuart Scott. But something happened to me. I got a graduate assistantship as a mentor and as a deputy coordinator of this summer bridge program. And a part of the program had Black male athletes, particularly big time blue chip football and basketball recruits who were coming to Michigan State. And so it was through those experiences where I was mentoring and working with these young men, mostly Black, and I started to ask critical questions around the organizational structure, culture, process, practices of these athletic departments, which is what led me really into an interest in research. And I'll give you an example. I took a class with Yvonne Smith, who was a sports sociologist at Michigan State. And that's where I was first exposed to Jay's book, Sport and Society, Issues and Controversies. Prior to that point, I hadn't had a chance to really study sport in a very systematic, formal way. And so for me, that was the entree into the sociological study of sport. And then, 2 decades later, the culmination of my book that you read at the end in my intro was 20 years in the making. Really, that particular class in the late 90s is what kind of led to this work that I'm still doing. So that would be an example I'd share.
It's so fascinating hearing everybody's stories. It's just the places where we overlap with each other, the places where we differ. But I think for sports scholars, our sports experiences are so profound upon the scholarship that we're now doing. Yeah, go ahead, Jay.
Yeah, I think one of the things I noticed as AJ and John were talking is that they were prepared for these kind of interdisciplinary subjects. And sports sociology is interdisciplinary. One of the things that has kept me in it and curious and expanding my curiosity. And anything related to sports studies and sport management and kinesiology are by their very definition interdisciplinary. So, we have backgrounds where when we get together, we understand each other in a way because we are drawing from a variety of literature sources, and we're thinking in a number of different disciplinary perspectives and trying to combine them. And that makes things really interesting in a career.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So just to kind of add on to that, Jay's book in that particular class, it was a master's level class called Sociocultural Issues in Sport. It really exposed me also to the language, for example, critical theories. I mean, the way that Jay wrote the book in a very accessible manner. It had a critical bend to it, but it was very accessible as a student being introduced to that type of, what some people would say, heavy reading around a serious topic such as the sociology of sport, right? And so for me, that was very important. And I have to give a shout out to Yvonne Smith and her class. And in fact, it was her class that pushed me to get a PhD. But what was interesting is, and I think for the longest, Yvonne probably was mad at me, I was going to stay at Michigan State and study with her for a PhD in the sociology of sport. But then I shifted to the Ohio State University to do my degree in sport management because I read the tea leaves, as they say. I saw that there was, in terms of academic jobs, I saw the writing on the wall in terms of future opportunities for gainful employment in the academy.
So I want to switch. Ooh, we got thunder out here. I don't know if y'all can hear it, but it's it's pretty significant. In fact, I'm supposed to be going to a soccer game tonight. We'll see if that doesn't get rained out. In any case, I want to switch gears a little bit right now. One of the things that struck us is that obviously students listening to this podcast are probably reading Sports and Society, and they're getting a definition of sociology and sports sociology. Many of them obviously are going to be in sport management classes, but not all of them. So I wonder, and maybe Dr. Singer, you could start us off and just talk a little bit. What is sport management as you understand it? And then Dr. Keaton, I know you'll want to add to that.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So, it's interesting, right? In our panel, we talk a lot about how folks in the field of sport management see it as the study of business principles applied to the study of sport organizations, right? And so for me, one of the definitions I like to think about, or descriptions, come from an edited book, which I happen to have a chapter in, by Matt Bowers, Marlene Dixon, and Florian Hemme. It's the second edition of the book, Sport Management, an exploration of the field and its value, right? And so they're really kind of playing off of this idea where Lawrence Chalip talks about these ideas of the legitimations of sport, right? And they kind of describe sport management more so as providing sport in a way that really legitimizes the public investment on which sport depends, right? And so whether you're arguing that sport matters because health benefits or economic development or community development and social inclusion or national pride, right? Or socialization of the youth, right? Which is very germane to what we talk about in the sociology of sport. And really, sport management involves this idea of understanding that sport goes beyond just a business focus to really understand the social, cultural, and the political implications therein of sports existence in society. And that as an effective sport management, we need to be in the business, quote unquote, of justifying these legitimations that we claim to be attached to sports existence as a public good.
Yeah, I would say, for me, out of my 3 degrees, my last one is sport management. So I think these weren't conversations that I had to wrestle with too early on into my academic career. But I think my definition probably isn't the field definition. So I just understand sport management as the dissemination as it regards the organizing, leading, business practices. If you have to put on sport, what goes into putting a sporting event on? I think I now have thought of sport management even more broadly as it gets to merchandising. I also see how sport management, for me is touching, very clearly now, like marketing schemes as we're seeing with Google ads and the WNBA. I also see sport management touching high fashion when we're thinking about the Met Gala. And so for me, all these different streams are in the ways that sport management is relevant. I think what makes it sociological for me is thinking about all the nuances and how people and interpretations and politics and power shows up in these spaces. And so I say that to say that I actually didn't know sports sociology or sociology and sport management were different until I got, maybe third year of my dog program. I was like, oh, these people don't all see themselves as sport. There's these disaggregations. And so I think I would also say I understand the field is there's sociology of sport, there's management, but there's also the sport and education folks, which I think gets left out, and they can fall into the sociology of sport and sport management camp. But I'm thinking of, people who really are attentive more to the intersection of higher ed. So I'm thinking of conferences like CSRI, the College Sport Research Institute. I'm thinking about colleagues that go to AERA, the American Educational Research Association. And then I'm also thinking about, the people that see themselves as sport, but they're sport studies. And so I think all this language matters because it identify, where to place each other. And like, how do we understand that placement of each other when making sense of the work that we do? So I see it all as sport and they're all interconnected, but I do recognize that many people across those 4 or 5 sport sectors or communities don't always see themselves as interconnected.
Yeah, as I listen to both of you talk, it really rings bells because teaching in Colorado Springs in 1978, when the USOC moved to Colorado Springs and the Olympic Training Center opened there, I worked with a number of federations as well as the USOC. And in the process, obviously, I came into contact with people who were in sport management positions. And as I worked with them, the thing that came out very clearly to me is that in sport management, you're dealing with sports in a social and cultural context. And understanding that context is absolutely crucial for success in sport management. And so the combination of sociology of sport and sport management just kind of naturally was rolled into my career as well. So we share some things in common there.
Yeah, and Jay, to that point, I think I always reference an article that was published in 1993 in the Journal of Sport Management by James Bryant, that talks about the interdependence between the two fields, right? And really arguing that sociology serves as the base for understanding sport as a social product, right? And so I always, in the doctoral seminars I've taught at Texas A&M on social issues in sport, I always have the students engage with that very, very short piece, 4 or 5 pages, but very relevant and significant to these conversations around why we should be talking about the complementary nature of the fields, not any supposed real or perceived differences.
Yeah, Doc, you already know how I feel. I challenge my colleagues all the time. I'm like, that's a very sociological question. Oh, you're studying gender and women's clothing and like using it through, let's say, like Fairclaw and like CDA, like that sounds very sociological to me. And so I think one hat I put on is kind of being the person in sport management that is really challenging people to grapple with why they don't want to be seen as sociological. And I think because sport management has been trying to legitimize ourselves as like this subfield that really trying to hold tight to management. But I would argue in the management space, like the broader field of management, they're very more open to understanding themselves as sociological. So I think it's really interesting to see, if we are going to be this subfield of management and management is very comfortable with sociology, why is that not trickling down?
And AJ, I don't know if Jeff and Jay, you all know, but we just recently at the NASM conference, North American Society for Sport Management, we just did a workshop, and I'll let AJ led it and invited me and Chris McLeod, a sport management scholar, and it was very well received. I thought it went well. So I'll let AJ kind of share a little bit more about that if she's willing.
Yeah, we're having this conversation, and as a mom, that feels like 8 years ago. I'm like, "Oh, yeah, we did do that. We did just do that 6 weeks ago." But we basically, took this idea based on what the audience, from NAS when we had our panel discussion saying, like, "Why don't we have this at NASM?" And so we took it to NASM, 3 of us who are very sport management and sociology of sport, and I think, demonstrating to them, like, the consciousness that we have to have with the way we're articulating research questions, the way we are, using our like sociological inquiry to think about like how is this inquiry tethered to management decisions or policy implications, or if we are connecting it back to capital, that economic rationale. And so I would say it was a very intentional workshop. But I think what I like about it was that folks that maybe didn't see themselves as sociological were wrestling with just how much of the work actually is, and we don't even have to say sociology. And so that was one thing that I think I wanted the audience to walk away with was like seeing our research questions, seeing our methods, seeing the content, but at no point do we have to name it as sociology. because we know if we do, you may interpret it as not being management enough. And so really unpacking that for folks.
This has been the series of podcasts we're doing has just been fantastic for me, and I've learned a lot. Plus, obviously the panel we did together a few months ago, because coming out of a sociology, not sociology of sport program, but just sociology where sport is not taken seriously. Sport management has been very distant from me. So I've really been learning a lot. In fact, a previous guest argued that sport management is not simply about the management of business, but also the management of health and recreation resources within communities. So what that means, it's centrally about people, their differences, and their needs. And this seems like something that sociology is especially adept at addressing. Excuse me. So I was wondering to what degree, for each of you, your the sociological training you've had has helped you address people's needs in your scholarship and in your praxis.
AJ, you want to start?
Yeah, I can start. I think, for me, I always tell people that I don't detach myself from the type of work that I do, particularly in the sport management space. And so that like sociological imagination or that sociological inquiry is really coming from my lived experiences. And so I can give an insight to like two projects that I think really unpack that. I would say one that was published with my colleagues, Lauren Hinman and Neff Walker, is one night in 2022, we were watching the WNBA draft. And this is the draft with Emily Engstler. Her name is so hard. Emily Engstler, and then Destiny Henderson and a couple other really great college players. And we noticed with Destiny Henderson that she was in a fitted tux. She had a snapback. She had on big, chunky, like rapper jewelry. She had on customized sneakers. And we, at the same time, my colleagues and I, we were engaging with the WNBA draft hashtag. And we're noticing like no one's reinforcing that she should be dressing like a woman, or no one's trying to question that she is a woman or telling her to get back in the kitchen. There were these interactions with fans that were like, oh, this is fire. This is hot. Where did she get that? And we also noticed this like sexualization, particularly of the athletes who were known as queer. And so we're taking all this in and we're like, let's download these tweets. And then so we do a CDA on this, we download the tweets. And this started off as us, again, as sociological beings, making sense of gender, race, and fashion from our own lived experiences, but then connecting that to the research, but then making the bigger connection to like leaning into Black culture and Black language is actually extremely profitable for the WNBA. So I don't mean to like chew our horn, but I don't know if y'all seen the marketing with the WNBA as of late, but they have really leaned into fashion. They've really leaned into being these like kind of cultural icons and being very visible. We've also seen an uptick in the dynamics between hip hop and the WNBA in similar ways that we've seen previously in other eras with the NBA and hip hop and Black culture. And so really demonstrating like there's these interpretations that are happening, that they're not just there for the basketball. They're there because WNBA players are seen as cultural curators, and particularly from the politic of their identity as queer women and as queer Black women. So that's one project where I can say like really making that connection for folks. And then another one is when I was working on comprehensive exams, there was this moniker that y'all might be familiar with during summer of 2020. It was the Karen moniker. And thinking about white womanhood, weaponizing this like white femininity, particularly at times that was very dangerous for Black people, and especially Black men. And so I started thinking about if we know white women are the category of women who are often held in leadership positions, how are they making sense of whiteness in the same ways that we are always challenging white men to make sense of whiteness? And so started a project where through white women's leadership was asking them critical questions about race and their own racial identity and how their racial identity showed up in the work. And I think what was powerful was their reliance on naming gender, like gender marginalization continue to come up. And so really unpacking for folks that like these conversations that we have or these ideas that we have, they show up in the way we think about leadership. They show up in the way we think about who's putting on the sport product, if we go back to that WNBA paper. So I always tell people that my projects that are very sociological, they really start with me and how I'm experiencing the world as a Black woman, as a mother, as a friend, and so on.
Yeah, and I'll jump in now. And so when I think about how sociology, my education in this wonderful discipline, has informed my past and present research, I'll give a couple of examples. And so, again, I have to go back to those early days in the late 90s, reading Sport and Society and other sociological texts, learning about the different, from functionalism to conflict theory to critical theories to symbolic interactionism, that began to give me the language to make sense of what I always kind of knew through my lived experiences, but didn't have the words or the tools to name it, right? And so, again, that kind of led to my research lane on Black male athletes as primary stakeholders, quote unquote, of big time college sport, right? And even taking a page out of AJ's book, where you talked at our panel, AJ and Nazem, where instead of defining, when you study, for example, Black women in sport, instead of calling it in the Sport Management Journal experiences, you may refer to it as organizational behavior, right? To meet the language of the folks, speak the language of the sport management folks, if you will. And so that's something that I've picked up on in my sociological training. Another example I'll give you on, I didn't share this earlier, but I grew up in the high school as a golf caddy at a prestigious country club in southwestern Michigan, Pointer Woods Golf and Country Club, which culminated for me in a full ride scholarship called the Evans Scholarship to Michigan State University, and is sponsored through the Western Golf Association. I was at the time in the early 90s, one of the few Black students to receive this scholarship. And at the time, the Evans Scholars was pretty much confined to all the Big Ten schools. Since then, it's expanded all the way to the East Coast, West Coast, and everywhere in between. And today I'm actually on the committee, the DEI committee for this organization, to help them think through how to continue growing the game of golf through caddying and offering young students like myself opportunities to go to college. And so some of the research I've been doing in the DEI space in the context of sport certainly has benefited from my early days of my sociological training, right? And giving not only in the scholarship that I've produced, that critical bend, but also in, the meetings I have with the Western Golf Association, which, by the way, next week I'm going to Chicago to continue some of my conversations with them. They're going through a process now, for example, where to appease their stakeholders, they're looking to find ways to change the name of the work they do, but still continue to do the work, right? We see this a lot in higher education, right? When I was an associate dean for DEI at A&M, there was a lot of talk about, once the legislation passed where these offices were banned, we had to think about how we wanted to pivot, right? And so that's what this sport organization that I'm working with is doing now. And I'm kind of having conversations with them around, doing what you need to do, but at the same time, keeping X, Y, and Z in mind if you want to be true to the mission that you've put out before the world.
I'm glad you said one of the things that you said, which is, about providing a language that you found really useful to describe the world that you already knew, which is something I see in my classes all the time. I first started to realize that when I taught at Cal State Long Beach. I was still in grad school at the time. And, so many of the students in my classes, their parents were immigrants, oftentimes undocumented immigrants. A lot of times their parents were they and their parents were refugees coming from different parts of the world. I always joke that many of the students lived in the neighborhoods where the rap songs are from. And so I was like, what do I have to teach these students? What really that they haven't already learned through their own experience? And I realized the main thing I was teaching was the language to describe the reality they knew, and that it helped them realize that they weren't crazy. It wasn't just them, and their experiences weren't unique. And they'd say things like, oh my God, now I understand why my dad does this, or now I understand why my mom is this way. It all makes a whole lot more sense.
Yeah, and Jeff, to that point, when and I talked about this in my book, when Tupac comes out with the song "White Man's World," that's critical race theory, right? Or when East Coast rapper Eric Sermon from the group EPMD, New York's finest, says there's 5 types of ball players: volley, foot, soccer, basket, base, all in the same race to win. But what happens when the clock stops? Injury and no more wicked jump shot. ESPN ends, and there goes your 2 million fans, and there goes your friends. They don't care who you are, what you did, use or where they now VH1 type kid. That's scholarship, right? That's saying the same thing that the sociologist says, but in a way that perhaps these young folks can hear, right? And so for me, I try to mix a lot of that into the work. And I know Jay, you and Keith Harrison did that special issue in the Sociology of Sport Journal on sport and hip hop, right? Which I think in 2020 was it? And I probably spoke to some of this stuff that I'm bringing up.
Well, I mean, I think that's what Antonio Gramsci would call an organic intellectual, someone who has that critical analysis but can speak the language that people speak, and not necessarily that academic language. Go ahead, Jay.
Yeah, to both AJ and John, when you talk this way in your classes, does it jolt some of the students who think of sport management strictly in a business sense and haven't thought about putting it into a larger social, cultural, and community context?
Yeah, I am after my first year at UMass and students getting to know me, I am the sociologist and the DEI person. But I also like to remind them that, like, I also have a little hint and taste of management. And so how I get them to make that connection was this past semester, watching the Super Bowl. And I, like, unscripted, saw the Kendrick Lamar halftime performance and was like, we're going to watch this in class. And I broke students up. So we played it for them, and then I broke them up by who can break down all the different cultural, social, politics happening in this performance. And I had like 2 white male students who loved hip hop, who I think everyone was shocked, like raised their hand, eager to do it. I had 2 Black students who also were into hip hop, and so really broke the groups down by that. But then I had some history students who were really into the, Samuel L. Jackson commentary on Uncle Sam, and like really educating students. I had students share that their parents told them to turn that off. I don't know what he's saying. Why is he mumbling? This isn't what I want to watch. And so then I had them say, like, okay, why do you think the NFL chose this? There's an economic rationale. Whether your parents, your grandparents, or your neighbor liked it or not, this was one of the most watched Super Bowl for performance. That's eyes, that's money. But also think about the complexities with Blackness and power and politics right now in a Trump presidency. And so, like, all these different layers, I'm having them think through. But then at the end of it, I'm saying, do you really think the NFL cared that your parents didn't like the performance? And having them really wrestle with, how do we make sense of capitalism? How do we make sense of politics? But how do we also make sense of our own lack of cultural knowledge to interpret that? So I had many students who were like, it was cool, I didn't notice anything. And I'm like, you didn't notice anything? Like, how is that possible? And so I'm very open with my students. I start every class really going over my educational background. I have them go to my Google Scholar page so they can see what I've written about, so there's no surprises. But I also am very clear with them that, to me, thinking about the social world of sport in this way is a concern to management, particularly because of the concern about people. So I always end with that.
Yeah, just to add to what AJ was saying, I think for me it's interesting, right? To your question, Jay, the undergrad students, interestingly enough, at least in my time at almost 20 years at Texas A&M. So I teach an undergrad diversity in sport class and sometimes a master's level diversity in sport class. And interestingly enough, for me, the undergrads seem to be more receptive to this type of approach than even the master's students. And I think a lot of that comes with this idea of, one, we get a lot of sport management students in there, but we also get students from across the university because it's a cultural competency. It counts towards students' cultural competency requirement at the university. And so we get students from engineering, pre-med, and it's really fascinating. I think it helps when I give the students my credentials, right? I worked in the NFL, I worked for the PGA Tour, right? I've had industry experience to go along with my lived experience playing sports, being a Black man in America. And so it really has given me, at least in my mind, at least from what I can tell, for the most part, credibility with a lot of the students that I've engaged. And I've had a few students here and there over the years who find themselves, put off by what I've published. I'll give you just one quick example. In the master's class, a student who obviously had done some homework on me because he shows up that first week just very resistant to any and everything I had to talk about. He's like, I don't want to be in this class, but it's required because I'm in the master's program, but I don't want to talk about Black athletes or race. And it was a very interesting and difficult semester, not only for me and that student, but the rest of the class because of that energy that we had to navigate for 15 weeks.
Yeah, I would say similar to you, Doc. I also feel the need to like, hey, I've done this, this, and this in sport, but I think just given my own millennial status and my proximity to students, and I would say on the faculty, I'm definitely the youngest, really at that Gen Z millennial hopscotch a couple years over, but for sure millennial. And so, but I do feel the need to like explain what I've done in sport. So I'll start off like, oh, I'm on the advisory council to the Colorado State AD. I've done consulting for X and X. I've presented and talked with X and X. And so because I never actually had like that traditional work experience in sport, I'm the straight through undergrad, master's, PhD. I've always felt the need to express like I do have the sporting experiences, particularly that they find of value and of interest, because although that's not the case with everyone on my faculty, I do have faculty, colleagues that are like, oh, I did 15 years here and I did, ran a sports agency for 20, 30 years. And like for students, that sounds just more legitimate than saying like, oh, I've been studying sport for 15 years. It just doesn't hit in the same way to them. But I do think that's part of me also, being in a business school where, funny story, I was told by a student that they thought in order for someone to be a professor in the business school that we each all had our own personal, really successful businesses. I was like, oh, you, honey, no. Many of us do not have these like really Fortune 200 businesses, but there's this assumption that you're in the business school, you must know how to run a business. And so they're expecting this knowledge from you. And so being the person that talks about these topics, I do have to kind of lean into like, how can I be seen as legitimate to them from that first week so they can buy in and really trust why talking about these topics matters?
This last semester, I was teaching sport sociology, and I had a student from actually the business school, and he wasn't even a sport management student. I suggested he take some of the sport management classes, since that's where our classes are. But he was funny because the first day of the semester, I mentioned that games in sport don't have to be organized around competition, and he almost fell out of his seat. He couldn't imagine, and asked me, like, explain, how can you have a game that's not based on competition? That was the first day of the semester. By the end of the semester, I don't remember what the question was. I asked the question, and these weren't his exact words, but essentially he said, well, it's because capitalists want to exploit their workers. And so, I was able to break down that resistance that he had. And I think it was really a step at a time. addressing people where they are, but also really providing useful information that is rooted in reality, the reality that people experience, that helps them understand their reality in a way that's different from what they've been told in other places. And for me, that's really the whole point of going to university. Nobody goes to university to be told what to think. We might provide, and we do provide, ways of thinking, and hopefully ways of thinking that challenge what we all believed growing up and what we hear in other places. Go ahead, Dr. Singer.
Yes, Jeff. So thank you for that. Your comment reminded me of why I appreciate Bowers, Dixon, and Hemi's book that I mentioned, I referenced earlier, is because they really understand and appreciate the complexities and nuances of sport, not only as entertainment, but also as activity, right? And there's different levels to sport and how we organize it, right? And so I just wanted to kind of throw that in there. The one time I taught the foundations of sport management class in my 19 plus years at A&M, I used that book because most of the books that tend to be in those like intro or foundation sport management classes just gives you a survey of all the different areas, right? You'll do a chapter on sport finance, a chapter on event and facilities management, a chapter on anything to do with the business school. And Dixon, Bowers, and Hemi, they tried to really kind of flip that on its head and talk about the management of sport from a broader, more inclusive angle. And so that was the one time I taught that class. I deviated from book that's typically used that gives a survey of all these different business or management areas of that we apply to sport.
Actually, Dr. Keene, I wanted to follow up on what you were talking about, because I understand, you talk about your credentials and your experiences to have students take you seriously. And as a woman and as a woman of color, I would imagine, especially in a business school, those are hurdles that you have to get over. I mean, there's a whole research on that. But the thing that I wanted to ask you a bit more about was, what are the kinds of knowledges you present to students that you find resonate with them, that you think is very impactful for them, that helps you, win them over?
Yeah, thank you for the question. That is, something that, I've always thought about my identity. And I think we all know the numbers of like Black women tenured or Black women that get to full professor, and we know they're bleak. But for the audience, I'm one of two Black women in the business school, that's in management and in sport management. And we're both assistant professors. And so thinking out of, I can only imagine like a couple hundred faculty for there to only be two, and we're untenured right now. And so, there is a power dynamic to that. I think how I have to navigate the space that I'm in, the content that I teach is, I don't like students to think they can place what my ideology is. And so I know there's some faculty who can come in like really strong with their ideology, with what they believe. I have colleagues that are in Soch and they're like, I walked in with my, never Trumper shirt or hat. And like, I just think those aren't politics that I can really navigate in my classroom. And so this semester, when we were talking about trans athletes, I had them listen to 20 minutes of Riley Gaines. And Riley Gaines giving a speech in Minnesota, denouncing trans athlete participation. I had them take notes on her arguments. I had them think about, where were her arguments stemming from? How did that connect to right-wing politics? Was there any validity to what she was arguing, from their standpoint and their experiences? And then so they sat with that for about 20, 30 minutes. And then for the second half of class, I had them listen to the experiences of what it means to be a trans athlete from a trans athlete. And so students, when I met with them at the end of the semester, they were like, you're one of the few classes I've had where you forced me to grapple with polarizing ideas and really make sense of where I stand, and like really wrestling with, well, do I kind of agree with that? And do I kind of agree with that? And, I think that's just kind of me as a person, but I think that really does stem from my identity and how I'm able to teach these topics. I don't think I can teach it and say, I think Riley Gaines is intolerable, and like they already think I think that, right, by being the person that's teaching a diversity and inclusion class. And so what I think I have to do is really unpack the political aspects of what I teach, because being a Black woman in the School of Management is already inherently political.
Well said. Wow. So since I have two critical sport management scholars with us, I was wondering how you understand something. So I noticed that FIFA has recently made the decision to not address issues of racial discrimination at their games any longer. And I guess they had decided to do that after 2020. So there's this moment where, and it's not just FIFA, right? It's lots of sports organizations. After we see all of the social unrest and uprisings in the summer of 2020, there's this embrace of, DEI and DEI language. But now we're seeing a rolling back of that embrace of the DEI language. How from a sport management perspective, how do you understand, like, and I've written about this stuff, and you can it's in Sports and Society now. But how do you all understand that from a sport management perspective? One, the fast uptake of DEI language, and then the fast letting go of DEI language by major sport organizations.
I would say I'm genuinely not surprised. I remember summer 2020 for various reasons, but one thing that stood out to me was all the statements. I was like, this is uncomfortable. I remember being like, I know a lot of people were praising it and liking it, but I always felt icky about it. Because I think you can never understand, like, and this was my management hat. I was like, well, then when don't we make a statement? Like, this just happened to the Mexican American community. Do we make a statement for that? This just happened to the Jewish community. Do we make a statement for that? And I think, to me, where these two worlds collided was, for me, October 7th. And I was kind of looking around to see, like, were sport organizations going to have that same energy in some way? And it was quiet. Then I started thinking about Gaza. Were sport organizations going to have something to say? And it was quiet. And then I did notice statements when it came to trans athletes and trans visibility from the WNBA. I wasn't as surprised by that, but I was still always in that era. I didn't think it was going to last, because being a sociologist, I was very attuned to, like, this burgeoning and very organized right wing extremism in our country. And so I always knew there was going to be a moment of tension where sport was going to have to decide, what it wanted to represent. I think if we also connect this back to capitalism, which, sure, Jeff, I'm assuming you did, there was an economic rationale to be a part of this. And I think now there's an economic rationale to not be a part of this. And so when we're thinking about, the woes and ebbs and flows of capitalism, I think it's funny when I get questions when people are like, are you going to change your research agenda? And I was like, why? So in 10 years, when it's popular again, I'm now researching these topics again. And one, you can't erase what I've already said off the internet anyways. But, like, I think there's this assumption that the work that, John and I do was going with, like, the waves of the movement. And you can look at his work 20 years ago. It still represents, where he stands today. And I think my work and where I was becoming a professor coincides with 2020. And so it could look like my work was just, like, hopping on this trend. But I think for all of us that engage in this work, it's deeply personal and deeply connected. And so I don't think sport organizations, I think stakeholders in sport, but not sport organizations, actually can feel as deeply connected to the work across the board in the way that we saw represented in 2020.
Yeah, and so just to add to what AJ is saying, it makes me think about, it's very predictable. Wesley Lowery has a book out called American White Lash. This predictable what Kimberly Crenshaw, CRT pioneer, calls racial retrenchment, right? And others have talked about it, right? So it's throughout U.S. history, we've seen this, right? This so-called, whether it's real or perceived progress, and then rollbacks, right? When they become frightened about what they're seeing, right? The potential of what they're seeing to push back against the white racial status quo, right? Or what Fagan and Doucet call the elite white male dominant system, right? Which is greatly enabled by acolytes of all backgrounds, right? Class, race, gender backgrounds. And so when you talk about studying sport organizations and what we do, I mean, that's one of the things I often have put in my most recent work. I'm doing a study now with a group of, so it's called Black and Asian Solidarity, what it means to sport management and why it matters. You know, it looks like it's going to get into one of these major journals. We just went through the second round of revisions, and we're talking from our vantage points, the narrative of just two black scholars and three Asian scholars on this paper. And we're wrestling with this idea of how do we, from a managed sport management lens, push back, you know, in solidarity with these respective communities and others against this elite white male dominant system, which is the common enemy of us all, right? And so that's kind of my contribution to this question, Jeff, important question that you raised.
Now, this is all great stuff. Now, we're running a bit short on time, and as always, I get a little greedy with such amazing guests. So I am going to squeeze in one more question. One of the perspectives Jay and I and a lot of sociologists take is, sociology has a whole lot to offer sport management. But I think that question should go both ways. What do you think that for people that are taking sociology classes, whether it's in a sociology department, kinesiology department, education program, doesn't really matter, right? And they're reading Sport and Society, what can they learn from sport management? Why is it important for our students to also be studying sport management alongside of their sociology, would you say?
Yeah, I can just to conclude here, then I'll kick it over to John, is I think one thing that have been challenged in the management space is to really see it through. You know, I think sociology does a great job at unpacking, at critiquing, interrogating. But like what's the fix? Like what propositions do you have? What resolutions do you have? I think that is, you know, as someone that's boundary spanning both spaces, you know, I can do a paper in the sports sociology space and outline all the issues and like why this is a problem on across different levels. And that's okay, right? We can leave it there. I think in the management space, if you name it, it's like, well, then what should we do about it? There's a much bigger emphasis upon praxis in the sport management space. And that's what I think those who see themselves as maybe more staunch sports sociologists or sociologists in general, it's thinking about you have just uncovered something that most people couldn't see. I mean that like metaphorically as well. You know, what should they do with this information? And that praxis is really what I take from management.
Yeah, it's like AJ was reading my mind. I was thinking about this critical praxis. There's becoming more and more space. You know, I think about our dear colleague AJ in sport management, Lorena Haber, right, who a Canadian scholar who does a lot of qualitative work and wrestles with this question around, is her work sociological, right? And you know, we talk about this idea of critical management studies, which is an area we see in the management literature that more and more sport management scholars are starting to embrace. And so I think this idea of the praxis becomes a contribution, I think, that sport management as a field can make to those who are studying more of a sociology or sports sociology discipline. And so, yeah, I'll stop with that.
I think that what you're both saying is at the basis of one of the things that have brought Jeff and I together. I mean, when we do our research, we're always thinking of the application of knowledge and not just the production and distribution. We're thinking about the application of that knowledge. And when I worked with federations at the Olympic Training Center, that's where my connection with all of those sport management people really came together. And because they, by necessity, were concerned with application, in their sport development programs. How do we keep young people? How do we recruit and retain young people in our sport development programs? And my research on socialization dealt with some of those application issues, and that really resonated with the people in sport management. And as I talked with them, their approach resonated with me because they were focused on application. I mean, that was their job. So coming together was not a big deal. I mean, it was kind of a natural relationship, and the longer it existed, the more we appreciated each other.
Yeah, I think being the young buck in this virtual space, I think one thing that's really, powerful to hear is that it seems like the gap between the two is becoming smaller and smaller, particularly for those of us that are assistant professors. We really don't feel the need to be one or the other. I tell people that like each year you see me going to both. I value both spaces very much. And I think this relationship and these conversations, I do hope they continue, but I do think it's really cool to see generationally, the three of us being different generations of scholars, how this gap has essentially become, like I said, for me, I didn't even know there was a difference when going back to, maybe when John and Jeff were coming up, where it was a little bit more segregated or divided. And so I think, in the audience with the reality that as new generations of scholars are seeing themselves having conversations across the aisle is getting smaller.
One of the last things I wanted to make sure I put out there, I always think about who I consider to be a big brother and a mentor in this work, Harry Edwards, right? And I look at his dissertation work, which became his book, Sociology of Sport, 1973, which happened to be the same year I was born, and how a lot of his work, right, as a activist scholar, led to much of the consulting he did with sport industry organizations, particularly the Bay Area professional sport teams, right, the Golden State Warriors, the San Francisco 49ers, and how here's a sociologist. He was a pure sociologist who happened to convince his PhD committee at Cornell University to let him study sport as a sociological phenomenon after much back and forth, as he tells in some of his testimonies about how you mean to tell me that, you have the Super Bowl, you have millions of people across the world interested in this thing called the Super Bowl, but it's not worthy of study. And I always appreciated that story and how, as a sociologist, he was able to become consultant for people who manage big time professional sport in the U.S. And so, again, both fields can benefit from each other. And I don't think it should be a situation where, even though sport management as a discipline has usurped, rightly or wrongly, the study of the sociology of sport, it shouldn't be this, one is better than the other. It should be we work in concert to produce knowledge and practical applications of that knowledge.
That is just such a great place for us to bring an end to this episode, because one of the things you're getting at, Dr. Singer, is that we have this academic model developed in the 19th century that divided the work, the academy into these specific disciplines that were well suited to address the issues of modernity. During the Industrial Revolution, as urbanization is going on, there were all of these problems, and the university was very well developed to address many of those problems. And well, we're in the 21st century, and we're pretty far into the 21st century now, and it's a different world, and the knowledge needs for this world are different than they were in the 19th century. And so what we call interdisciplinarity now, right, it's just a realignment of how we organize ourselves to generate knowledge that will solve the problems of the world that we're living in. And that is the purpose, as far as I care, of universities, is to solve the problems of the world that we're living in, to prepare people give them the knowledge and the tools to address those problems. So thank you very much. This is fantastic. I love this discussion, and I think we're going to keep having this discussion for at least the foreseeable future. To everybody listening, what do you think? What are your thoughts? Jump on our Discord server, Sports and Society, right? We have a Discord server. An invite link will be available in the description of this episode. And thank you so much for your time, for your knowledge, and for all of the work that you're doing in the university and in the communities that you're in.